The fluorescent lights in courtroom 3 of the Auckland District Court hummed the way they always do in government buildings, that low, indifferent buzz that doesn't care whose life is being taken apart underneath it. I'd been sitting at the defendant's table for 40 minutes, and my daughter-in-law's barrister had spent most of that time making sure everyone in the room understood exactly what kind of man I was. He kept referring to his notes with the theatrical patience of a man who charges $400 an hour and wants you to feel every minute of it. "Your Honor," he said, adjusting his glasses, "Mr. Fawcett currently resides in a 2-bedroom rental in Papatoetoe. He receives New Zealand superannuation of approximately $872 per fortnight. He drives a 2003 Holden that, according to my records, failed its last WOF and required significant repair costs." He paused. Let it breathe. "My client, his daughter-in-law, earns $178,000 per annum as a senior partner at Marchetti Legal. The family home in Remuera is valued at $2.4 million. The suggestion that Mr. Fawcett has any legitimate claim to the estate of his late son or any standing to challenge the current asset arrangements is, frankly, an insult to this court's time." Someone near the back of the gallery murmured something. I didn't look around. I was wearing the same gray pullover I'd worn to my son's funeral 14 months earlier. It wasn't a statement. It was just what I owned. My solicitor, a young woman named Aroha who'd taken my case through legal aid, put her hand lightly on my arm. We'd agreed I would say nothing during the opening submissions. Nothing provocative, nothing emotional. Just sit there and let them build their picture of me. The picture they were building was accurate, as far as it went. Retired. Modest income. Modest everything, really. A widower who'd spent 30 years as a land surveyor for the council. Raised one son. Loved him quietly. Buried him too early. The barrister Thornton was his name. Graham Thornton. Thornton Graves Associates. I'd looked them up, continued laying out the case. My son Callum had died 18 months ago, heart attack at 44, which the doctors said was rare, but not unheard of in men with his history. He'd left behind a wife, 2 children, a substantial estate, and a will that had been rewritten 7 months before his death. The new will left everything to his wife. The old will, the one he'd written when the children were small and things were different, had included a trust for his kids, a provision for me, and several specific bequests. That will had been replaced quietly with a new solicitor. During a period when my son had been, in the words of the updated document, of sound mind and full understanding. I had my doubts about that. Thornton was now describing me to Judge Harriet Ngata as a grieving father who had, in his emotional distress, developed an unfounded obsession with contesting a legitimately executed legal document. "Mr. Fawcett has no legal training," he said, with a tone that made it sound like a character failing. "He has no direct evidence of undue influence. He has, with respect, an old man's grief, and nothing more." Judge Ngata looked at me over the top of her reading glasses. She had the kind of face that had heard everything twice and still paid attention. "Mr. Fawcett," she said, "you've been patient this morning. Is there anything you wish to say before we proceed to submissions?" Aroha gave me a small nod. "No, Your Honor," I said. "Not just yet." Thornton smiled at his notepad. The judge looked back at me for a moment, longer than necessary. Then she turned to her registrar, a young man with neat hair, and said something I couldn't hear. He stood up, walked to the door at the back of the bench, and came back 30 seconds later with a sheet of paper. He handed it to Judge Ngata. She read it, looked up at me, read it again. "Mr. Fawcett," she said carefully, "before we continue, would you please state your full name for the record?" I straightened in my chair. "Reginald Owen Fawcett," I said. The room was quiet. "I'm sorry," the judge said. "Could you repeat that?" "Reginald Owen Fawcett." She set her pen down on the bench, slowly. The way you set something down when your hands need a moment to catch up with your brain. Thornton frowned. Your Honor? I'm not sure what, Mr. Thornton. Her voice had changed. The procedural warmth had been replaced with something measured and careful. I'm going to ask you to sit down. He sat. My name had been classified for 11 years after I retired from it. That classification had lapsed 2 years ago, which was why I'd been able to use it here today. In this courtroom. In this particular case, in front of this particular judge, who had, as I'd known she would, spent time as a barrister in financial crimes before taking the bench. She knew exactly who I was. Or rather, she knew exactly who I used to be. Let me take you back to where it really started. Not the courtroom. Not even my son's funeral. Back further. Back to the year my son married the woman who would spend the next decade trying to erase him. Callum had always been the kind of person who assumed the best of people. I'd watched it his whole life. As a boy, he'd defend the kid everyone else was picking on. As a young man, he'd loan money to mates who never paid it back and call it fine. It wasn't naivety exactly. It was more like a decision he'd made early on about how he wanted to move through the world. And he stuck to it, even when it cost him. He met his wife at a networking event in the city. She worked in law, not as a solicitor yet. She was still studying, but she had the manner of someone who'd been practicing authority for years. Polished. Precise. The kind of woman who made every room feel like a slightly formal occasion. I was polite. His mother, God rest her, was warmer than me about it. She said the woman had good posture and bright eyes, and that was enough for her. I kept my thoughts private. They married when Callum was 32. The first few years were what you'd call functional. They bought the house. Had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, 7 and 9 now. Callum ran a small civil engineering consultancy. His wife climbed steadily through the firm. Things looked fine from the outside, but Callum rang me one evening about 4 years before he died. He'd had a few beers, and his voice had that particular looseness that means someone is finally saying the thing they've been holding. He said he thought some of the money wasn't adding up, that they'd refinanced the house, and he couldn't quite follow where the equity had gone. That his name was on a company he didn't remember agreeing to. That when he asked questions, there was always a reasonable explanation that somehow left him feeling more confused than before. I might just be thick about this stuff, Dad, he said. Finance isn't my thing. You're not thick, I said. She's the lawyer. That doesn't mean she's right about everything. He went quiet for a bit. Then he said, I just don't want to make a big thing of it. If I'm wrong. That was Callum. Never wanted to make a big thing of it. I should tell you what I did before the council, before the surveying, before the modest superannuation and the 2003 Holden. I spent 22 years working for a unit within the Department of Internal Affairs that most people have never heard of. Financial intelligence. Not glamorous. Not the kind of thing you tell people at barbecues. We tracked the movement of money through family trusts, through company structures, through estate arrangements that looked legitimate on the surface but had been engineered, quietly and methodically, to move wealth from one set of hands to another, without anyone noticing. I was good at it. Better than good, my supervisor used to say. Though he was a man who measured his praise carefully, I had a particular instinct for the architecture of concealment, for seeing the shape of what was being hidden by looking at what was being shown. I retired at 62. My wife had been diagnosed the year before, and I wanted to be home. We had 4 years together after that. Good ones, mostly. The kind where you rediscover what you actually like about each other when work isn't filling up all the space. She died on a Tuesday in April, and I was holding her hand. And that was that. After she went, I had time. Too much of it. I started with the phone call from Callum, replaying in my head. Then I started making notes. I wasn't investigating my daughter-in-law. Not officially. not in any way that required a warrant or a badge or anything, except patience and a decent understanding of how the company's register and the land information database worked, both of which I could access as a private citizen with enough time, and the right search terms. What I found over the following 18 months was not simple. It was not a single act of dishonesty. It was a structure, a careful, layered structure that had been built slowly over years, the kind of thing you only recognize if you've spent decades learning how to look. There was a family trust set up in my son's name, but with his wife as the sole trustee. There were 3 limited liability companies registered at an address that turned out to be a storage unit in Henderson. There were property transactions that moved in directions that didn't make commercial sense unless you were moving money rather than investing it. There was a pattern of refinancing that had extracted substantial equity from the family home over 6 years, equity that had flowed into company accounts, that then flowed into personal accounts that were not my son's. And there was the will. The previous will had been straightforward. Everything to my daughter-in-law if she survived him by 30 days, otherwise into a trust for the children, with me as a backup trustee. Standard, careful, the kind of document a man writes when he's thinking clearly about what matters. The new will, signed 7 months before my son died, had removed the children's trust, removed me, and simplified everything down to a single beneficiary. It had been witnessed by 2 people, a paralegal from his wife's firm and a man whose name I'd seen before in the directorship records of one of those Henderson companies. I took everything I had to the one person I trusted completely, my old colleague, a man I'd worked alongside for 15 years, who had retired 3 years before me and now lived in Tauranga growing tomatoes and occasionally consulting for the Financial Markets Authority. His name was Gideon, and when I spread my notes across his kitchen table, he put on his reading glasses and didn't say a word for 40 minutes. "This is enough," he said finally. "To do what?" "To take to someone who can actually move on it." He looked at me over his glasses. "This isn't a family dispute, Reg. This is financial elder abuse nested inside a deceased estate matter, nested inside what looks like it might be a broader pattern." He tapped one of the pages. "This company director, Vaughn, I know that name. There's been a suspicious transaction report sitting with the FMA for 2 years involving a similar structure, different family. Same smell. I hadn't known that. So it's not just Callum. I don't think your son was the first." We sat with that for a while. What I wanted to do was go straight to the police, lay it all out, watch it move. What Gideon told me was that it wasn't that simple. The FMA referral was stalled. There were questions about jurisdictional overlap. A complaint had been made before, by another family, and it had gone quiet in ways that Gideon thought were connected to a particular law firm's willingness to run interference. My daughter-in-law's firm. "If you go in through the front door," Gideon said, "and anyone at that firm gets word, the company records will be amended, the accounts will be restructured, and you'll have nothing." He looked at me steadily. "But if you go in through a courtroom, she's applying to have the estate finalized," I said. "She'll need a hearing, and if you contest the will, she has to respond. Formally. On the record. And if you can get the right judge." We looked at each other. I knew Harriet Ngata's reputation. She'd spent 8 years doing fraud and financial crime work before taking the bench. She wasn't connected to Marchetti Legal. She was known, in the circles I used to move in, as someone who read carefully and didn't miss things. The will contest was my way in. The next 4 months were the strangest of my life. My daughter-in-law's legal team had filed their application to finalize the estate. When I lodged my caveat, my formal objection, they responded with exactly the contempt I'd expected. The letters from Thornton Graves Associates were polite in their language and dismissive in their substance. There were references to my age, to my grief, to the emotional difficulty of losing a child. One letter, I noticed, referred to me as an elderly gentleman without legal background, which was technically accurate and entirely beside the point. I let them keep thinking that. Aroha had been assigned to me through the legal aid system. Fresh from her admission, earnest and thorough. When I sat down with her in her small shared office and explained what I actually had, she went very still. "You need to tell me everything," she said. "Not yet." She stared at me. "I need you to trust me," I said. "There are things I can't share until the moment is right, because if they reach the wrong ears too early, the evidence becomes harder to use." I watched her processing this. "What I need you to do right now is file the caveat, respond to their letters, and make sure this case gets to a hearing. That's all." "That's not all," she said. "You're asking me to run a case blind. I'm asking you to run the visible part of a case while I carry the parts that aren't visible yet." She looked at me for a long time. "Are you going to tell me who you used to be?" "After the hearing," I said. "I promise." She wasn't happy about it, but she was sharp enough to see that I wasn't a confused old man with a grievance. "There was something in my eyes," she told me later, "that made her decide to follow the thread." The morning of the hearing, I woke at 4:30. I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the photograph I keep on the bench. Callum at about 15, standing on a beach somewhere on the Coromandel, squinting into the sun, grinning at something his mother had said just off frame. He had no idea what was coming. None of us ever do. I put on the gray pullover. It wasn't a statement, but I didn't change it either. The chaos in courtroom 3 happened quickly once it started. Judge Ngata had set her pen down. The registrar had returned to his seat. The room was holding its breath in that odd way that rooms do when everyone present can sense that the shape of the day has just changed, even if they don't yet know why. Thornton recovered first. He was a professional, and professionals are trained to recover. "Your Honor, I'm not certain what relevance the name Mr. Thornton," Judge Ngata said. "I'm going to ask you to hold that thought." She turned to her registrar and said something quietly. He left through the side door again. When he returned, he was accompanied by 2 people. I recognized not personally, but by the manner of them. The slightly too careful suits, the lanyards tucked just inside the jacket, the way they moved into a room without announcing themselves. Serious fraud office. My daughter-in-law, sitting at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than my car, looked at them with the polished confusion of someone performing surprise. "What is this?" she said to Thornton. "Graham, what is?" The taller of the 2 stepped forward. "I'm Detective Sergeant Parada. This is Detective Constable Reed. We're here pursuant to a warrant issued this morning by the Auckland High Court." He looked at my daughter-in-law steadily. "The warrant relates to an investigation into fraudulent transactions, misappropriation of trust funds, and obtaining by deception. We need you to come with us." Thornton was on his feet. "My client is in the middle of legal proceedings. Whatever this relates to, the appropriate course." "The warrant was coordinated with the court," Detective Sergeant Parada said. "Judge Ngata is aware." She was. I knew she would be, because 6 weeks earlier, Gideon had used his FMA contacts to route my documentation package to the SFO through a channel that bypassed the jurisdictional tangle he'd described. And because I had, in a letter to the court 3 days ago, filed a sealed affidavit that included my former classification number and a summary of the evidence. I'd gathered evidence that the SFO had been able to cross-reference with their own investigation, the one that had been stalled, the one involving the same Vaughn, whose name appeared in my son's company records. My daughter-in-law stood up slowly. For a moment she just stood there, and I watched her face do the thing that faces do when a carefully built world starts to come apart, that split second, where the performance and the reality pull in different directions and neither one wins. Then she looked at me. Across the courtroom, across the years, across everything that had happened between us and around us and underneath us. You had no idea, she said. Her voice was almost quiet. You're just a retired council worker. Yes, I said. That's what I was counting on you thinking. They walked her out. Thornton stood at the plaintiff's table, looking like a man who has just discovered that the map he's been navigating by is for a different country entirely. Judge Ngata gave him a look of considerable significance before turning back to me. Mr. Fawcett, she said. Or the other title, if you prefer. Reg is fine, Your Honor. She almost smiled. I've reviewed the sealed affidavit. The evidence you've assembled over the past. How long was it? 27 months. 27 months. She looked at the documents in front of her. In my 20 years on the bench, I've seen families torn apart by contested estates. What I haven't often should has a strategic mechanism to surface a broader financial crime investigation. She removed her glasses. That takes a particular kind of patience. I had reasons to be patient, Your Honor. Your son. My grandchildren, I said. Mostly. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she put her glasses back on. Given today's developments, she said, I'm issuing an immediate freeze on all estate assets pending the SFO investigation. Administration of the estate will transfer to the public trust in the interim. She paused. With respect to the children's welfare, I am satisfied on the evidence before me that a guardianship review is warranted. I'm referring that matter to the family court with an urgent notation. In the meantime, I'm granting you interim contact rights as a grandparent, effective immediately. I had to look down at the table for a moment. 27 months. All those evenings at the kitchen table with Gideon's notes and my own notes and the photographs of company structures that blurred together after midnight. All those weekends I'd driven past the house in Remuera and sat in the car for 10 minutes before driving home because I wasn't allowed inside. All those phone calls from my grandchildren that were too short, too supervised, too careful. Aroha put her hand on my arm again. This time I let myself feel it. The school was a 20-minute drive from the courthouse, a private primary in Epsom with a long driveway and a uniform policy, and the particular quiet of a place that has never had to worry about its role. I parked behind a row of SUVs and walked to the office. I had the court paperwork. I had my ID. I had the interim guardianship notation. The woman at the front desk rang through to the principal. There were phone calls made, documents examined, a brief and slightly bewildered conversation between the principal and someone from the family court duty line. And then, 15 minutes after I'd sat down in the waiting area with a cup of tea I didn't drink, my 2 grandchildren appeared in the doorway. My grandson was 9. He looked at me with his father's eyes, that slightly cautious assessment that was really just attentiveness, wearing a shy face. My granddaughter was 7. She walked straight across the room and put her arms around my waist without saying anything, and I held the back of her head with one hand and tried to remember how to breathe. Koro, she said into my chest. That's what they called me. Koro. Their mother had never liked it too informal. She'd said, not really appropriate given he's not Maori, but Callum had encouraged it, said it was just a word for grandfather and a perfectly good one, and so it had stuck. Hey, sweetheart. My grandson had moved closer, but hadn't committed to the hug yet. He was 9. 9-year-olds have dignity to maintain. Where's Mum? He said. I crouched down so we were level. She's with some people who need to talk to her. It's going to take a while. I looked at both of them. You're coming with me for now. We'll sort out the details as we go. Mum said you always make things complicated. My grandson said. She's not entirely wrong about that. He studied me. Is everything okay? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about Callum at 15, squinting into the Coromandel sun. I thought about the phone call 4 years ago, the loose voice, the careful questions, I don't want to make a big thing of it, Dad. It's going to be okay, I said. There's a difference. We walked out to the car. My granddaughter climbed into the back and immediately started telling me about a project she was doing on native birds. My grandson got in the other side and buckled his seatbelt with elaborate concentration and said nothing for the first 2 minutes of the drive, which was fine. He'd talk when he was ready. At the lights on Manukau Road, he said, "Is your car always this messy?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I'm old and I've given up caring about some things so I can care more about others." He thought about this. "What do you care about?" I glanced in the rearview mirror. My granddaughter had stopped talking about birds and was listening. "You too," I said. "Mostly that." The trial took 14 months. These things always take longer than you expect. And the SFO case was complicated by the fact that my daughter-in-law was one of several defendants. Vaughn, the company director, had indeed been running a wider operation. And she had been both a participant and, in some respects, a facilitator who'd brought in client families from her legal network. 3 other estates were involved. Other grandparents. Other children. I gave evidence twice. Once in the SFO matter, once in the associated civil proceedings around the estate. I sat in those witness boxes the same way I'd sat in that courtroom quietly, in ordinary clothes, and said what I knew to be true. My daughter-in-law's barrister, not Thornton, he'd had the sense to withdraw, argued that she'd been manipulated by Vaughn, that her level of knowledge was limited, that she had not understood the full criminal nature of the arrangement. The jury didn't agree. Not entirely. She was convicted on 3 of the 7 charges: misappropriation of trust property, obtaining by deception, and 1 count of fraud. Vaughn went down on all 12. She was sentenced to 3 years and 8 months. Given the children, given her record, given everything, the judge suspended 12 months. She would serve 2 years and 8 months before parole eligibility. I drove to the courthouse the day the sentence was handed down. I sat in my car in the car park for a while afterward. I wasn't celebrating. I want to be clear about that. When you're my age and you've seen enough of what grief does to families, victory is not really the word for any of this. The right word is closer to, the ground is level again. Not good as new, just level. The estate was distributed according to the original will, once the courts had worked through the reconstruction of which assets were legitimately Callum's and which had been extracted. The children's trust was re-established. I was named trustee, as Callum had originally intended. The house in Remuera was sold to fund the trust and the restitution orders. We moved. The kids came to live with me in Papatoetoe temporarily, everyone said, though I suspected we all knew it wasn't. The 2-bedroom rental became a 3-bedroom in Mongaray Bridge after I used a portion of my own late wife's insurance settlement, which I'd never touched, to cover the rent differential. It has a backyard. My granddaughter has opinions about what to plant in it. My grandson has opinions about everything, which I suspect he inherited from me. Gideon came up from Tauranga about 6 months after the sentencing. We sat on the back deck while the kids watched something noisy in the lounge, and he brought a bottle of Central Otago Pinot Noir that was far better than anything I would have bought myself. "You did a remarkable thing," he said. "I did a slow thing," I said. "There's a difference. You could have blown it up faster, gone to the media, made noise, and the evidence would have scattered, and the lawyers would have buried it, and my grandchildren would have grown up with a mother who'd never faced a consequence and a story where the wrong side got to write the ending." I watched a blackbird picking at something in the lawn. Some things need time to become undeniable. He poured me more wine. "Do you ever think about going back? Consulting? Even?" "No," I said, without having to think about it. "You were one of the best." "I know." I looked at the back door, where I could hear my granddaughter explaining to her brother why you should never plant mint in the ground. But there's better work to do. My daughter-in-law will be eligible for parole in 14 months. My grandchildren see her once a fortnight video calls, supervised, which will likely transition to in-person visits as the parole conditions evolve. My grandson doesn't say much on those calls. My granddaughter chatters about birds and plants in school, and I watch her from the kitchen, and I think about what children are able to hold and how much stronger they are than we give them credit for. She asked me once, about 3 months after everything, whether I thought her mother was bad. I turned that question over carefully. I said that her mother had made choices that hurt people, that some of those choices were choices she probably knew were wrong at the time and made anyway, and that those kinds of choices have consequences. I said that didn't mean she didn't love her children, because I believed she did. I said that love and honesty aren't always the same thing, and that learning the difference is one of the harder lessons a person can face. Did she love Dad? My granddaughter asked. That one sat with me for a moment. I think she loved the life she was building, I said finally. Whether she understood what she was dismantling in order to build it, I'm not sure she ever let herself look at that directly. My granddaughter nodded slowly, the way children nod when they're filing something away for later. She'll come back to it. They always do. I think about what I would tell someone who was standing where I was standing 2.5 years ago, sitting in a small rental, watching a structure of deception harden around the people he loved, knowing what he was looking at, and knowing also how easily it could be dismissed. The old man's grief, the retired council worker, the grandfather with no legal training and a car that barely passes its woof. I would tell them, the people who underestimate you are giving you something. They're showing you exactly how much room they've left unguarded. And if you're patient, if you're honest, if you build something that can't be explained away, then the moment will come when simply saying your name is enough. I would tell them, quiet is not the same as powerless. Ordinary is not the same as defeated. And the truth, when you've taken the time to assemble it properly, doesn't need to raise its voice. I would tell them also this, that justice is not about revenge. Revenge wants the other person to suffer. Justice wants the record to be correct. There's a significant difference, and knowing which one you're after will determine every decision you make along the way. And I would tell them what I told my grandson last week, when he asked me why I hadn't just called the police straight away, at the very beginning, when I first suspected something was wrong. Because the truth is only as strong as the evidence behind it, I said. Anyone can say something is wrong. The harder thing, the thing that actually changes anything, is being able to prove it in a way that can't be taken apart. He thought about it. He's 9, and he takes things seriously. So you waited, he said. I waited. Wasn't that hard? I looked at him. His father's eyes. That careful attentiveness. The hardest thing I've ever done, I said. But some things are worth the wait. He nodded. Then he went back to whatever he was doing. In that way children have of filing things away without making a fuss about it. I went and made tea, stood at the bench, and looked at the photograph of Callum on the Coromandel. Thought about the call 4 years ago. Thought about how he'd said, I don't want to make a big thing of it, Dad. I made it a big thing, Callum. I hope you'd understand. The blackbird was back in the yard. The kettle boiled. Somewhere in the house, my granddaughter was telling her brother, again, about the importance of proper drainage. Some things, if you tend them right, do grow. There's something I've come to understand about the way consequences work. And it has nothing to do with luck or fate or anything beyond the simple logic of cause and effect. What a person builds over years, through the choices they make quietly and consistently, that structure becomes real. It becomes load-bearing. And when it finally meets the truth, one of those two things gives way. In my experience, it's never the truth. My daughter-in-law spent years constructing something she believed was airtight, Trusts, companies, amended documents, a will rewritten when my son was too ill and too trusting to interrogate it. She moved carefully. She used her training, her contacts, her instinct for the kind of legal architecture that looks legitimate until someone who knows how to read it actually sits down and looks. She was intelligent. I want to say that plainly, because dismissing her as simply greedy or simply corrupt would miss what actually happened. She was intelligent, and she chose to use that intelligence in a particular direction. And that direction led her, in the end, to a courtroom in handcuffs. I think about Callum's phone call. The careful questions, the reluctance to make a big thing of it. He sensed something was wrong, but didn't trust his own instincts enough to follow them all the way. That's not a failing, it's what happens when someone has spent years being told that their confusion is their own limitation rather than a reasonable response to something designed to confuse them. I couldn't give him back those years. What I could do was make sure the record was corrected. That's what I mean when I say this wasn't about revenge. Revenge would have been some burst of anger in the moment. A confrontation. A scene. Something that made me feel better for 30 seconds and changed nothing. What I chose instead was slower and harder, and the only thing that actually worked. I chose to become undeniable. I chose to take the time to build something that couldn't be explained away by a good barrister on $400 an hour. And here is what I'd say to anyone who finds themselves where I was 2.5 years ago, sitting in a rental in Papatoetoe with a pile of notes and no clear path forward. Your ordinariness is not a weakness. The fact that someone has underestimated you, dismissed you, written you off as an elderly gentleman without legal background, that is not the end of your leverage. That is the beginning of it. Let them build their confidence on a false picture of you. The gap between what they think you are and what you actually are is exactly the space you need. Patience is not passivity. Patience is what you do when you understand that the timing of the truth matters as much as the truth itself. Gideon told me once that the best financial crime investigations don't move fast. They move when the evidence is so complete that there's no angle left to attack. I applied the same principle to this. 27 months. Every thread followed, every date checked, every name cross-referenced. Not because I was obsessive, but because I understood that my grandchildren deserved something that would hold. The education I'd take from all of it comes down to 3 things. And I think about them when I'm sitting on the back deck, watching those 2 kids argue about mint. Integrity is the long game. It doesn't pay off by Friday. It pays off when the moment arrives that requires it. And if you've kept it intact, it's worth more than anything money can construct around it. Intelligence without honesty is just a more sophisticated way of getting lost. My daughter-in-law was clever, but cleverness in the service of concealment eventually runs out of room. Honest thinking, even slow, even uncertain, finds its way through. And persistence, the quiet daily kind, is the thing that most people underestimate most. Not the dramatic gesture, not the confrontation, just the decision, made again each morning, to keep going, to keep building, to keep trusting that what is true will eventually be provable. My grandson asked me last week if it was worth it. I told him yes. He asked why. I said, because you're here, and the record is correct, and one day you'll understand what that means. I think he already does, a little.